OGL? More like, oh good lord! Let's try to parse through all this WotC drama and see where it lands us in the end. Friends, it has been a long couple of weeks. Normally, I thrive in the chaos. I love what manner of machinations come from the unknowable and unpredictable futures spun forth from it. But this was, and still is, something else. Since releasing my last video on the topic, I've seen the full fury of this community come to bear on Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro for attempting to eliminate what little good faith and trust remained for just a few pieces of silver. Many of you have exclaimed that you're looking for new systems to play. Many of you have sworn to never pay another dime to Wizards of the Coast, and even more still have alleged that they will give up on D&D entirely. This sentiment is not something that I personally wanted to see, but one that I also had a hard time denouncing. I myself have spent the first few weeks of this new year turning pages in new TTRPG rulebooks and guides in an effort to understand what else might be out there in the wake of all this negativity. In the spirit of that, please, as I touch on this topic and share my personal thoughts and opinions, consider your own reactions. I especially urge my fellow creators to fight the good fight and not rely on information that has not been properly vetted and verified. Throwing more unfounded vitriol into the ethos will only muddy the waters and make it harder for us to reach the common goal that we shared in the beginning, a proper open gaming license that allows us to keep playing and creating the game we love so much. If you'd like to know more about what's occurred thus far in the Chronicles of WotC's Folly, you may want to check out my first video here. But with all that out of the way, let's delve into what has happened since then. After hearing the concerns of the D&D community, WotC responded with silence. That is, until a new leak was filtered through several creators in the D&D space, detailing the fact that WotC and Hasbro were mainly gauging community response to their changes by looking at D&D Beyond subscription numbers, since potential income damage from those subscriptions was the easiest to track in the short term. Once this was brought to light, many users sought to send a message by canceling their subscriptions, myself included, with big names and popular content creators leading the charge. And it would seem that this leak held water, as a short time later WotC finally addressed many of our concerns. It took them nearly a full week to put out any meaningful comment on the matter, and when they did, we were slapped in the face by an oddly passive-aggressive statement that depicted a sore response from the WotC team, yet ultimately promising to do better and release a new version of the OGL. Rightfully so, the response upset many who were concerned over the issue, and the noise only became louder until we were finally given what I felt was a somewhat amicable response from WotC, this time via an executive producer from Dungeons & Dragons, Kyle Brink. Kyle, if you're out there watching this, thank you. Your words were a breath of fresh air to myself and my friends. We still think we have a lot of work to do, but thank you. This post detailed Kyle's personal experience with D&D as both a game he plays and one his team helps to create. And he was the first of any person at Wizards that I know of to formally apologize for all the terrible events of the last several weeks. His and Wizards of the Coast's promise from there is to be more transparent with these changes to the OGL, to give time for the community to aptly supply feedback, and to accept the blame in its entirety for the poor language and requirements of the previous draft OGL. In seeking this new goal, expectations for a new OGL draft were set to be delivered on or before Friday, January 20th, with an easy-to-submit survey, much like the rollout of Unearthed Arcana playtest material. And as you might have guessed, since you're probably viewing this on or before that Friday, we now have that new OGL draft in hand, coupled with another post from Kyle. Before going into the OGL itself, they mentioned that the D&D core mechanics will be given to the community via a Creative Commons license, even though my understanding is that game rules can't be copyrighted anyway. Many of my friends in the comments of my last video were very vocal about that. Now, I'm not here to stick up for Wizards of the Coast, but I do want to present this information in as unbiased a way as I can. So I do have to say that I appreciate this move as a good faith example for what WotC is trying to show the community they're all about from here, as they go on to further state that using quintessential D&D content like Owlbears, Mind Flayers, Magic Missile, and more will be covered under the OGL, deemed 1.2, as a perpetual and irrevocable license. I put some stress here because it was a major point of confusion in the comment section of my last video. The term perpetual indicates that there is no explicit expiration date. The old OGL was perpetual. The term irrevocable means that the license can never be taken back and will always function as a viable license, adhering to the rules therein. The old OGL was not irrevocable, sadly. But hang on. They actually redefine irrevocable in the contract itself in such a way that the license itself is revocable, but the content published under this new OGL would be allowed to exist under it forever. And if we go back to what they said in the post, it states specifically that the license contains the word irrevocable. Kyle, you sly dog. You thought we wouldn't notice, didn't you? Next, Kyle talks about OGL 1.2's differences from 1.0a, stating that it allows them to address hateful content by potentially terminating a license if it is deemed in breach of that agreement, and this new OGL would only apply to published TTRPGs, including those found in virtual tabletops, for which there is a new VTT policy specifically. Some have already stated their distaste for the broad definition of hateful content here, since WotC and Hasbro would ultimately control the definition of that term. Generally, I understand why something similar might have to exist in an OGL, but perhaps it could use some more rigorous definitions so that the clause cannot be mishandled. The virtual tabletop policy, on the other hand, sneakily infers something I take more direct issue with. It states that while you are allowed to use SRD content under the OGL to display text for spells like Magic Missile and do the damage calculations for said spell, you cannot create a visual representation of that Magic Missile flying across the board to strike the target. They claim that animations like this are more of a video game and are therefore not allowed. I understand that they likely need to draw the line somewhere between what is VTT and what is video game, but I would argue that anything that enhances the tabletop gaming experience without becoming something else entirely should still be allowed. And even that aside, a lot of DMs create extremely immersive setups at their tables. I know I've often fantasized about using a projector to emulate live spell effects. That's all part of the tabletop experience in my own opinion. Really, I feel this screams that Hasbro is worried that someone will make a cooler virtual tabletop than their D&D branded one. And if they don't plan on using any animations in that 3D environment they showcased a while back, they're probably right. Moving on to speak about what isn't in the new draft, Kyle specifically mentions that they have removed any language regarding royalty payments, financial reporting, license back, registration, and distinction between commercial and non-commercial. I have to say, that alone addressed the majority of my personal concerns, though we'll touch on some details regarding that statement before pressing further. Kyle is right on most of this, but it should be noted that the license back agreement that previously allowed Wizards of the Coast perpetual and irrevocable free use of your content under OGL 1.1 now simply states that they do not own or license your content. However, if you do attempt to sue them for the use of your work in their publishings, the existence of that work does not serve as proof of it being stolen. I was truly curious as to how they'd work around the license back statement since, as I'd mentioned in my previous video, it was likely just in there to protect them from the accidental uses of others' work. At the time, I suggested that they make a change that only applies to those instances, and it seems like they've certainly made an attempt. Could this still be abused by Wizards of the Coast? Potentially, but I do understand their need as a corporate entity to protect themselves from frivolous lawsuits and the ability for content creators to still seek damages with proof outside of the existence of similarities in their publishings. And seemingly taking note from other feedback they received from the community, they also explicitly mentioned that works published under the old OGL 1.0a can continue to exist under that license. That was another main concern I had before, now addressed. So if we do end up wanting to switch to Pathfinder, now we can. That said, they do mention here that the old OGL will still be deauthorized, as it simply does not allow them to make some of the other changes regarding hateful content if publishers can still actively use the old OGL moving forward. Personally, I can understand this reasoning, and I see their logic playing out here. At the end of the day, to enact the changes that they want, which seem at first glance to mostly be above board and beneficial to the community, they'll have to deauthorize the old OGL. But I am no lawyer, so feel free to tell me I'm wrong in the comments. Also with this draft, they've mostly lost their ability to change terms with just 30 days of notice, a previously massive issue with OGL 1.1. Under those old guidelines, they would have been able to change requirements and amounts owed for things like royalty payments and really do anything else they wanted with no restrictions. But they can still change how you might be required to cite OGL content in your work and how you can contact them, but this also seems fairly innocuous. I've already seen some argue for this to just be removed as well and for them to just republish a new OGL if that has to change later down the road. But I'd wager that Wizards of the Coast wants to avoid any future OGL updates after this one. And with all the junk running through my mind and making a mess of things, I'd rather they left it alone too. Does this mean that we should just accept this OGL draft? Absolutely not. This is just a draft after all. I personally plan to submit the opinions I listed here for them to sort out with a new document, and you should as well. Feel free to let me know down in the comments if I missed anything or if you have a differing opinion. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates and go out there and make some chaos.